A city of 2.3 million people sits in the middle of a scorching desert, kept alive by a single shrinking lake. That lake has been losing water for 2 straight decades. At its worst point in 2022, the math was terrifying. Not a water shortage, not rationing, complete collapse just months away. The response was unlike anything a city had ever attempted. Workers drilled 3 miles straight down through some of the toughest rock on the continent, punching through the floor of the reservoir itself to tap water, sitting so far below the surface that no drought could ever drain down to reach it. Engineers called it the third straw. It took 7 years and consumed $1.4 billion. It was the deepest municipal water intake ever constructed in the country, and the lake is still dropping. The tunnel has a lower limit. The water has a floor, and if the reservoir ever sinks below that floor, all that drilling, all that money, all those years of work become completely pointless. So the real question is not whether the engineering was impressive. It was. The question is whether a man-made hole in the ground can actually win against a desert that has been drying out for 1,000 years. Nothing about the Mojave Desert suggests a city should exist there. Rainfall barely reaches 4 inches a year. Summer heat pushes past 115 degrees on a regular basis. No rivers cut through it. No major underground water reserves sit beneath it. The ground is ancient and cracked and completely indifferent to human ambition. Every environmental condition says this is a place where large numbers of people simply cannot survive long term. More than 2.3 million people disagree. In 1940, the area held around 8,000 residents, a small, dusty railroad stop. Then came gambling, highways, air conditioning, and the kind of relentless American growth that never stops to ask whether it should. Decades of expansion that urban planners had not modeled and water managers had not prepared for. By the 1990s, it had become one of the fastest growing metro areas in the nation's history. No shortage of anything slowed it down. Not land, not heat, not water. Today, 40 million tourists pass through the region every single year, all of them showering, flushing, and filling swimming pools in a desert that gets less annual rain than most cities receive in a single week. Combined with permanent residents, the total water demand sits at roughly 300,000 acre-feet per year, close to 98 billion gallons, enough to submerge all of Manhattan under 3 feet of water and repeat the process every 12 months. That is not the water budget of a careful city making measured decisions. That is the budget of a place that grew as though geography were optional. Nearly 90% of every drop comes from one source. One river feeding one lake managed by one agency trying to balance an equation that stopped making sense a long time ago. The Colorado River does not look powerful. It runs brown and wide through canyon country, and from a distance, it looks like any other river. But 7 states and 40 million people rely on it completely. The agreement dividing that river's water among those states, signed in 1922, was built on a serious miscalculation that nobody caught until it was too late to fix cleanly. The negotiators in 1922 based their calculations on flow measurements taken during an unusually wet stretch of decades. The numbers looked solid at the time, the river was producing well, the future felt spacious. Nobody asked whether the data reflected actual long-term averages or whether they had simply gotten lucky with the timing. Scientists have since confirmed the answer. The compact allocated more water than the river reliably produces in most years. That was not a small rounding error. It was a foundational crack embedded into the entire water policy of the American Southwest, growing more dangerous with every passing generation. Every city that expanded, every farm that planted against that allocation, every development that assumed the river could keep up, all of it rested on numbers that were wrong from day one. The water flowing toward the city collects in Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, sitting along the Nevada-Arizona border behind Hoover Dam. The system was designed for a world of surplus years and dry years trading off predictably. For a long time, it worked. Then the dry years started arriving back to back, without the wet years following to refill what had been lost. There is a number that matters most in this entire story, 895 feet. That is the elevation at which Lake Mead hits what engineers call dead pool, the point at which water can no longer pass through Hoover Dam under any conditions. The pipes are still there, the pumps still exist, but the water is simply below where any of it can reach. Every promise made to every city and every farm downstream becomes a useless document at that number. The city built its water supply in layers, extending it deeper as the lake kept falling. The first intake pipe went in during 1971, drawing water from an elevation of 1,050 feet. At the time, it seemed more than sufficient. The lake was healthy. The idea that it might ever drop low enough to threaten the intake felt like an abstract worst-case scenario that planners could acknowledge and then file away without urgency. Population doubled, then doubled again. By 1993, one pipe was no longer enough. A second intake was built at 1,000 feet, designed as backup coverage in case the lake ever fell far enough to put the first one at risk. It felt like solid forward thinking. Engineers felt prepared. Officials felt covered. Neither pipe was ever designed for what actually happened. The early 2000s brought the first signs that this was not a temporary dry spell. The decline was slow at the start, a few feet per year, easy to explain as a short-term fluctuation that the next good winter would erase. The reassuring story of natural weather cycles kept getting harder to repeat with each new measurement. The lake kept falling. By July 2022, the elevation had dropped to just over 1,040 feet. The first intake was dangerously close to losing contact with the water surface. Federal projections stopped hedging. Continued decline was no longer a possibility. It was a probability. Something had to be built deeper. The only open question was whether the geology would allow it. The plan required drilling a tunnel 3 miles long through volcanic basalt, some of the hardest rock anywhere in the continent, while staying hundreds of feet below an active reservoir holding trillions of gallons of water directly overhead. The target elevation was 860 feet, below dead pool, below anything either existing pipe could reach. Lower than any city water intake had ever been placed in the country. The margin for error was essentially zero. A tunnel boring machine named Sandy by the crews operating her was assembled underground and set to work in 2008. She was 23 feet across and built for precision. The geology had other ideas. Unexpected rock formations forced full recalculations. Equipment failed under pressures the models had not accurately predicted. Water seeped through rock fissures faster than sealing work could keep pace. Underground temperatures were punishing. Workers spent shifts in deafening, confined spaces with an active lake pressing down from above, aware that a single serious miscalculation could not be reversed. Maintaining accurate alignment across 3 full miles of shifting volcanic formations required continuous measurement corrections. A deviation of even a few degrees compounded over that distance meant missing the target completely. Sandy finished her run in 2014. The tunnel was sealed, tested, and declared operational in 2015. The engineering had succeeded. The bill arrived with it. $1.4 billion collected from southern Nevada residents through steadily climbing water rates over the years of construction. No vote was held. Most people only partially understood what they were paying for. Critics called it excessive. Environmental groups called it the wrong message entirely. But by 2022, water managers estimated that without the third straw already running, the region would have faced cuts severe enough to destabilize the broader economy. The city had purchased something. What exactly it had purchased was still being determined. The crisis the tunnel was built for arrived on schedule. In 2021, federal water managers issued the first ever official shortage declaration on the Colorado River. Not a forecast, not a warning. A formal federal designation that triggered mandatory cuts across multiple states simultaneously for the first time in the river's managed history. A moment that water policy experts had spent decades predicting quietly arrived, buried in a government announcement that most of the country ignored. By mid-2022, Lake Mead sat at just over 26% of its total capacity. The lowest measurement ever recorded since the reservoir first filled in the 1930s. A lake that once covered 247 square miles and dropped 532 feet at its deepest point had been hollowing out steadily, shrinking back against the canyon walls that had held it for nearly a century. The retreating shoreline produced images that numbers alone could not communicate. Boat docks sat stranded far from the water's edge, their ramps ending above dry, cracked ground. A thick white mineral band climbed the canyon walls, marking every foot of water lost over 2 decades of decline. Old roads that had been underwater for generations reappeared. The foundations of buildings resurfaced. The ruins of a town called St. Thomas, flooded since 1938, came back into view as though the lake were returning its own history along with its water. Then the winter of 2022 into 2023 delivered extraordinary snowfall across the Rocky Mountains. The reservoir climbed more than 20 feet in 1 year. Federal projections were rewritten from scratch. It felt like the crisis had stepped back. Scientists pushed back immediately. One exceptional snow season does not cancel out 20 years of structural overuse. The lake remained more than 160 feet below full capacity. The recovery was genuine. It was also fragile, entirely weather dependent, and built on conditions that climate research suggests will become increasingly rare with each passing decade. Drilling deeper was only half the approach. The other half was consuming less. The Water Authority understood early that infrastructure alone could not solve an arithmetic problem this severe. A city pulling 98 billion gallons per year from a lake in a desert growing hotter every decade has a math problem that no pipe, regardless of its depth, can permanently outrun. The numbers always close the distance eventually. So, alongside the third straw, a different kind of project was constructed, not in concrete or steel, in behavior. The results are genuinely hard to believe. Since 2002, per-person water use has dropped by more than 40%, not despite population growth. During it, hundreds of thousands of new residents moved in over that same period, and the metro area still uses less total water today than it did 2 decades ago. By any honest measure, it stands as one of the most significant urban water conservation achievements in the country's history, accomplished in a city that the outside world had assumed was too defined by excess to ever change direction. The mechanics behind that number are deliberate. Roughly 99% of all indoor water is recycled. Treated wastewater discharge back into the lake earns the city return flow credits that count against its annual allocation. Every gallon used indoors and returned to the system is effectively cycled through twice. No other major American city operates at this scale. Outdoor water was where the heaviest changes landed. State legislation banned decorative grass. The turf lining highway medians, surrounding commercial buildings, and covering front yards that served no function except appearance was ordered removed. The program saves an estimated 6 billion gallons per year. 6 billion gallons that previously evaporated uselessly under direct desert sun. Residential limits entered the conversation next. Proposed legislation would cap household water use at around 163,000 gallons per year, the first restriction of its kind anywhere in the country. Residents pushed back. The underlying logic proved difficult to argue against. When a resource is genuinely running out, treating unlimited individual consumption as a protected right becomes an arrangement the system can no longer sustain. Every possible lever had been pulled. The tunnel was operational. The conservation numbers were real. The lake had partially recovered, and the trajectory was still not secure. The climate projections for the American Southwest are not complicated or contested. The region is getting hotter, drier, and less predictable. Every baseline assumption embedded in decades of water infrastructure is now under pressure. Models that described a worst-case scenario 15 years ago are now increasingly discussed as the expected middle outcome. The emergency that was supposed to arrive far in the future has a pattern of showing up early. The third straw draws water from 860 feet. That number was selected carefully, deep enough to keep functioning even after the lake drops below the level at which Hoover Dam can generate power. But the Colorado River system has an absolute lower boundary. Full dead pool at approximately 895 feet. Below that number, the third straw becomes irrelevant. The intake still exists, the tunnel is still intact, but the water it was designed to reach is gone, sitting below its opening with no way to recover it. The most expensive municipal water intake ever built in the country becomes, at that point, a monument to the limits of what engineering can accomplish. The most unsettling information comes from geological records rather than climate models. Tree rings and ancient sediment data show that the Colorado River Basin has lived through mega droughts stretching across multiple decades, events far more severe and far longer than anything captured in modern measurements. The 20-year dry period that pushed Lake Mead to 26% capacity may not have been an unusual outlier. It may have been a preview of conditions the basin has faced before and will face again. There is also a quieter danger forming below the surface. As the lake fluctuates dramatically in both directions, sediments along the lake bed shift and disturb. Those sediments carry heavy metals and toxic residues accumulated from years of mining and industrial activity in the surrounding area. Rising water floods contamination zones that were considered safely contained when submerged and undisturbed. The tunnel secures access to water. It says nothing about what that water may eventually carry with it. The city is not an isolated case. It is the most visible point on a fault line running through the entire American West. Phoenix depends on the same lake. Los Angeles draws from the same river. Farmers across two states irrigate against the same allocation that was promised in 1922 and that the Colorado River can no longer consistently honor. The compact renegotiation set for 2026 will force decisions that no engineering project can substitute for. How 7 states divide a resource that is shrinking faster than any of them planned for will determine which cities keep growing, which farms survive, and whether the tunnel beneath Lake Mead ever gets pushed to its absolute operational limit. What was built beneath the reservoir floor is real. The tunnel runs 3 miles through solid rock right now, drawing water from depths that no drought in the documented record has ever reached. That is not a small achievement. That is extraordinary. A city that had no geographic right to exist looked at an impossible problem and kept building anyway. That counts for something significant, but the tunnel did not fix the desert. And the desert has not stopped. What the drilling actually purchased was time. Time for conservation to reach further. Time for policy to move faster than it has ever moved before. Time for snowfall to return, and the reservoir to recover some of what it lost. Time for 7 states to come to a table and make decisions that their predecessors spent an entire century finding reasons to postpone. The third straw did not end the crisis. It pushed back the worst version of it. In a region running out of alternatives, that is not a small thing. Whether that time gets used for anything worthwhile is not an engineering question. The tunnel is already finished. The pipes are already in the ground. The hard work now has nothing to do with rock or machinery or construction budgets. It is political. It is cultural. It is the choice that 40 million people across 7 states have not yet fully been forced to confront about how to divide something that is steadily running out. The water is still moving, but deep beneath the surface of that lake, the clock has not stopped.